Welcome. Okay, let's get started with part 2 of the box modeling series. There's a lot more information to cover. In this tutorial, I'm using a set of custom key commands. You can find more info on that and a link to it in the description notes below. I'm going to go over the importance of edge flow and maintaining good topology. I'll show you several strategies for creating edge loops and discuss different methods for dealing with irregular geometry. In part 1, I went over subdividing shapes, smoothing them by pressing C, and pressing V to reduce the level of subdivision. And by adding more lines in the mesh along existing edges, I can swiftly create control loops like this using the Slice Around tool, pressing Shift S. Press Return to accept, and when smoothed, the extra geometry around the edges makes the shape sharper. Sometimes with this particular tool, the slice misses its connecting vertex and causes unexpected results. This is easy to fix. First, remove the subdivision, then go to Utilities and choose Merge Duplicate Points. And now when I subdivide, I no longer have errors. That's the thing about modeling in Hexagon or any 3D application. You really need to watch for when things go wrong and understand what might be causing the problems. At some point, I'll do another tutorial dedicated to common problems and solutions. Okay, so we have this box. What's important here is that we have two control loops flowing along each sharp side and control corners that look like this. And the further I move this edge away, the softer that side gets. It has less influence over that side. When making control loops, I strive to make them at consistent distances. However, it's not essential for them to be extremely accurate because the resulting differences will be very subtle. Okay, and if I want one side to be even sharper, I would add a double control loop here. On some shapes, the Slice Around tool doesn't slice in the direction you might expect because it's following the edge flow of the geometry it has. In those cases, I need to have different methods for creating control loops. For this shape, Hexagon needs more information. It could use a division here. I'm changing the flow of the shape by adding to the geometry. And now, when I cut around the bottom, it goes around the flow. I'll press Return to accept. So now I can continue to create control loops with various methods like this, selecting the sides and using edge tools, pressing Shift E, to extract a control loop. Ultimately, I want to achieve control edges around the whole shape like this one has. When I collapse the smoothing, I can see that the mesh has natural flowing lines around the shape. The triangular side naturally flows into this quad shape in an even and consistent way. And if I didn't like how that particular mesh was working, I would add specific geometry to change the flow direction. Naturally, I want to choose the best flow to represent the shape, but this isn't a visual thing as much as it is a technical thing. I need to take into consideration how the model will be used. Good topology will be critical in order for the model to be reused. This particular topology is okay, but it's not the best it can be. When the shape changes and becomes more complex, like this one here, I need to add lines to guide the edge flow in the direction I want it to go. In that way, it holds the shape together. With control loops along the edge flow, I can guide it to subdivide correctly. My goal is to have a unified mesh that flows from one shape type to the next without any distortion. It's a little hard to understand edge flow. I think of it this way. This is a flow, and this is a flow, and this. The edges follows the shapes and prescribes how they interact with the surrounding control loops. Bad topology looks like this. This is the same model, but it is a high poly version that's been decimated to work as a quick and dirty low poly model. You'll sometimes see this form of model for whatever purpose. It's one of these free models you'll find on the web. If you ever purchase a model like this, you might want to get your money back. You can also see bad topology in professional high-quality models as well. For instance, overly dense meshes and subdivided caps. That's not so bad, but it's not so professional or useful either. So you might be asking, why go through all this trouble just to get pretty smooth edges? After all, can't I simply bevel an edge to get the same effect? Like this, right? You totally could. And that's the best approach for some applications. It gives you a low poly model with nice edges. And this is sometimes referred to as mid-res modeling. But look closely. My model now has triangles and Ngons. And if you bevel or chamfer edges, you'll always need to deal with little details like this. Not all types of beveling will do this, but the more you do, the more problems you'll need to address in the process. And if I wanted to adjust how smooth one side is, I can't really do that without a lot of hassle or creating errors. Anyway, mid-res modeling is a whole other art form I'll need to cover another time. The advantage of box modeling is in its flexibility. At its base level, it's easy to edit. Also, in the end, it gives us an all-quad based topology. And if you are planning on selling your models, a clean, established mesh with good edge flow is required. People purchasing that model want to adapt the topology for their needs. They want to be able to easily access rings and add more control loops in areas where the model needs to bend. For instance, that's important for some models that need to deform for animation. And if you're worried about ending up with an overly dense mesh, well, as long as you stay at a subdivision level of 1, you'll produce a mid-res model at a degree similar to the manual approach with beveling. Moreover, a low-poly all-quad mesh can be easily triangulated as an asset for game development. Okay, so having an all-quad mesh is what we should really strive for as a final outcome, but it's not always required when you are constructing your model in an early stage. Here, I leave a 5-sided Ngon because I know that will give me a star, also known as a pole. And that's okay because it's on a flat surface. This is ideal because it uses less polygons than if I went with the all-quad approach. Like here, this one follows the form more accurately, but it uses more polygons. In the other model, I can leave that star there, but I know I can edit it later and convert it to a quad if I chose to go that route. Of course, use Ngons only if you intend to subdivide the shape, otherwise convert them to quads or tris. I like to use triangles only in logical places. Here, I have a triangle because when subdivided, it gives me a T-vert, also known as a kite, redirecting the flow in both directions. That's also efficient and lower res than if I used a quad here. But using T-verts is not always acceptable. You shouldn't use them to randomly correct topology. They are best used for triangle shapes like the one here, or along a curve or corner, but that's easier said than done. If you use correct edge flow to begin with, you'll rarely need to use T-verts. However you use Ngons or triangles, you want to use them with purpose. And on a symmetrical shape, use them the same way on both sides. So let's take a break from all this edge flow talk for a minute and look at the subdivision tool more closely. I kind of glossed over it in part 1, but the smoothing tools has some powerful features. Okay, so let's take this shape and activate smoothing. And whenever the object is selected in full object mode, I can see this icon here. Pressing that displays a set of different subdivision options. So let's look into this. This first row of icons are different subdivision types. Each one uses a different algorithm to subdivide the shape. The first, Catmull-Clark subdivision, is the default, and it's the best option out of the bunch. It's the one that gives us all quads evenly. Depending on which subdivision type I choose, it gives me some options in the row below. This first icon, it says change level of subdivision. It appears to be independent from the main subdivision, but it isn't. It's the same as choosing the range via the numbers at the top or typing the range here in the text box. Also, while in this mode, you can press the plus and minus on the number pad to change the range. But basically, it's just a way of changing the range while in option mode. See, when I press accept, it displays the range I set. This next option here is handy. That allows me to set the creases along the edges I choose. With the edge selection active, I can click off and on the edge to crease and uncrease it. For instance, like this. Unfortunately, I can only activate one edge at a time in this mode, but the quicker way to do this, I'll show you in a minute. Creasing shapes like this is useful for early stage shape modeling. If I collapse that, you can see what that looks like. So here's how creasing can be useful in another way. I can select the object's edges in edge selection mode, and I press Command A to select all edges. Then under the Surface Modeling tab, I choose Smooth, or I can press Command left bracket. Then give it a range of 1. Then I collapse the subdivision. And I now have a evenly tessellated shape. I have more geometry to work with to further develop the shape. Like this. Shaping sides. Rounding the back. And extruding. By the way, when you see this weird shading, it's just an artifact of the extrude. It's not affecting the model. It will go away when you continue to work or save and reopen the file. I usually just ignore it, but if it bothers you, you could quickly duplicate the shape and delete it, or you could switch to flat shaded mode. The other subdivision types are interesting. The Do-Sabin subdivision method subdivides differently. It's not optimal because it gives us triangle corners and sometimes Ngons. When I press accept, you can see that here. The corner is a triangle. And since we're trying to avoid that, it's not a good option to go with for box modeling. But having said that, it's still worth experimenting with. Smoothing with Bezier Interpolation is useful in several different ways. With it, you can control the global tension, inflating and deflating it, and that can give you some beautiful sculptural shapes, but it's also pretty wild geometry. It can also be used to tessellate a shape if you take the tension all the way down. But it's a little different and pretty powerful. This is a method for quickly generating control loops all around your sharp edges, if you don't mind all the post-cleanup involved to extract that. This is another example taken a bit further using that method. And I'll talk more about that towards the end of the video. This icon here, partial smoothing, this lets you select specific surfaces to smooth. It's sometimes useful if I want a bowed shape to extract and use that in another model. The loop and butterfly subdivision methods I won't go over because that subdivides with triangles. It is useful for some things like making rocks and fabrics and such. I may cover how it can be utilized in a different tutorial. It could be useful for some applications like export for 3D printing and sculpting. Okay, so I talked a lot about edge flow. Now let's talk about some strategies for creating control loops. So we saw earlier that I can use the Slice Around tool to make some quick control loops on each side of the shape, pressing Shift S. Like this. I'll merge duplicate points just in case this didn't connect all the way around. And we look at that with smoothing and you go, wait, what's with this weird smoothing here? And you look back and you think it has all the control loops like this box, and that smooths correctly. So why doesn't this? Well, actually this shape has two boxes and it's missing two control loops to keep its shape. It needs a loop here and here. So let's add that by copying the control loops from the outer sides. Loop select and press Shift E for the edge tools. Okay, and I'll do that for the other side. Now, when I smooth, it holds the shape. It's still a little blurry, but it holds. Now let's look at this shape. It's similar, but it has a corner here. In surface mode, I can loop select this, pressing Alt-E. Then press Shift-E for edge tools, and that will convert my surfaces to selection lines. And it's waiting for me to drag a line towards the center, like this. Now I can select the surfaces on the bottom here, and press Shift-D for loop tools, and pull up to make a control loop here. And I'll do the same for the other side. Now when I smooth this, it holds the shape on the sides, but it bends at the joint. Here's something to remember. Whenever you see this kind of a corner, it causes the flow to redirect around rather than along, creating a nice curve. And when I ring select, it follows the flow all the way around these sides. Now I can split it, pressing Shift X, to hold the shape better on these sides, but it will still curve because I don't have any control loops stopping it from doing that. Here, if we look at these two boxes, one has control loops strictly along the sides, the other is flowing around the sides. But when smoothed, they are very different. The one with the slanted corner curves the shape. That's because the edge flow is moving around the center and along the outer edge. So this is just something to be aware of while you model with this method. It takes much practice, but once you understand the principle of good edge flow, you'll be on your way to making great topology and fewer mistakes. Here's another example. I can select these two surfaces and press Shift-E for edge tools to make an inset cut across these two surfaces. I want to firm up these outer edges to hold the shape together on that side. So I select these edges here and loop select, then press Shift to add to the selection and loop select again. Then press Shift-E for edge tools and drag those edges to make the control loop on this side around these surfaces. So I have two edge flow channels on each side moving around my shape, each with slanted corners. And since there are no other control loops dictating where to flow, this edge will curve when smoothed. Because of these few simple lines in place, it holds the shape, and with the geometry I have available to me, I can do things like extrude, push and pull parts and bend it into different shapes I want, like this. And it's starting to look like a chair. I know this will have good topology because I created control loops and braces that guides the edge flow. Let's try something a little more complex. Let's take this shape and make a hole through it. Select this surface, then turn to the opposite side, and select this surface, and press Shift-B for bridge. This bridged the two surfaces right through our shape, making a hole. It's simply connecting geometry, just as if I was bridging shapes on the outer sides. Now I make a duplicate in full object mode, pressing Command and dragging the arrow. Then combine them as one, pressing Command-Shift-C. Then I'll select these two sides in between the shapes and press Shift B to bridge. Now when I smooth these, I can see I need to do a little bit more work to hold these shapes. First I'll ring split the center. Alt R, Shift X to split, Alt E to loop, and press B to bevel and split. This gives me an even split on both sides. I'll split the object up because there's no point in adding control loops to each side when you can just copy it to the other side. I'll press Shift S for slice around, and when I hover over this line I want to split, I can hold Shift to snap to the center of the shape. Then make the split here and press return to accept. Now I'll finish up making control loops around each side using the same methods. Now let's check that. It looks good on this side, so I'll delete the other side. I'll loop select these surfaces and then Command X to delete. And I'll switch to transparency and Control select this side and Command X to delete that. Now one thing I want to show you before I mirror the shape. If one of these sides were messed up, like here, if I accidentally move this apart, it's uneven, so it won't join automatically. And you can see when I mirror it, these sides need to be flat to join. So when this happens, and when it does, it's usually much more subtle than this, you need to flatten the edge. What you need to do is loop select it, and when I start to scale it in this direction, the numbers up here are changing. That's the one I need to type into, and type 0 to make it flat. Now when I mirror it, pressing Command Shift Alt N, it aligns correctly. And when I press Command Shift C to combine, they combine as one without a problem. Okay, pressing C to check that, to smooth it. This object needs more control loops to make every edge sharp, but let's move on to something else. A common thing you'll see in hard surface modeling are cut depressions in flat surfaces. So let's try that. First, select these surfaces and press Shift E for Edge Tools and bring in the edges to about here. So I have these types of corners when smoothed, and they give me these rounded edges. And the flow follows around smoothly until it gets about here. I have a triangle. That makes a weird corner that I don't want. To fix it, I'll first extrude to make the depression, and selecting these surfaces, holding Command, drag the handle to extrude down to about here. Now I'll select these two edges and press Shift X. That splits the surface. Then these two opposite vertices, I'll rotate around carefully. I'll select those and press Shift X to connect. Okay, so that gives me a curving edge flow here. Now all I need to do is move this piece out, making sure I'm in selection axis. That orients the handles to what I have selected. Using this corner handle, I pull it out to about here. And that will move the edge along the surface. If I want to be accurate, I can check the position number and match it to the one I pulled out. Okay, and I can do the same to the other side. Okay, I'll make a duplicate of this. Okay, now let's look at this one subdivided. Alright, obviously I need to make more control loops on this one. I'll make some edge loops like I did before. Alright, notice how the control loop follows the edge flow. It's doing that because it's following the existing geometry, but I need it to be flattened here. To do that, I'll loop select this edge, alright, and make this size 0 up here. Then I can move it a little bit, and I can do that because all of the vertices sit on the same ordinates. And I'll do the same for this one. Now let's smooth that and have a look. I can add a quick control loop along this flow. Ring select these sides, Alt R, and split Shift X. Then bevel to pull them apart. And quickly I'll do the same across the top. But wait, it's not going to be so easy to ring. That's because our flow has become multi-sided and complex. But mostly it's because that square here, it stops the flow. If I make a curved connection here, now the flow is established, and I can reselect the top with the ring. Okay, I'll go ahead and flatten out these two sides. And quickly do that. Then I'll loop select and split. It's a little distorted, and that's because it's flowing around, following the flow, and there are different size bending areas. I could clean up each one, selecting them and scaling them inward like this. And I could dissolve this line if I want to make it a quad. Moving forward, I'll ring select this inner part and split it. So when I smooth this, the corner is holding, but for the overall shape, it's going to take too long to show how to fix the rest. But hopefully you get how this can be done, applying control loops one at a time. Now let's try the same thing making automatic edge loops. Selecting the duplicate. Because this shape is very cubic, I can apply a Bezier smoothing on this, then selecting the global tension and move it all the way down to -1 and press accept. This gives us this. Every corner has a control loop. It's pretty extreme, but it can be cleaned up fairly quickly. I'll collapse the DG. And now when I subdivide this, every side has a nice super sharp corner, except where I allow it to have a curved one. Now I can work backwards to reduce detail by loop selecting and dissolving extra edges. And this shape is simple enough to do that. Here's another example. One thing to note, this method doesn't work on spheres or cylinders because it takes every edge and makes it sharp. To round it out, you would need to do some heavy editing. Also, the base shape can't include any triangles or Ngons, and you need to avoid poles and T-verts. For hard surface modeling, this is an excellent method for building foundation shapes quickly and then working in rounded parts and details afterward. And you can take this to the extreme, rapidly blocking out objects, auto-control edging, and part by part, reverse editing, and adding details. There's still a ton of information I need to cover, but this video is getting long and I need to cut it here. So it looks like I'll see you in part 3 of this box modeling series. If you found this helpful, please share it with anyone you think that might like it. If I see that people are getting some value out of my videos, I'll make more. Thanks for your support. Cheers.